the very first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet.
I have already described, dear reader, the strange and almost fateful manner in which our little band of wanderers came under the protection of the Mormons. It is now my duty to set down the continuation of that story, for in it lies the key to the entire mystery which baffled London's police, and which only my companion, Sherlock Holmes, could unravel. After their rescue upon the Alkali Plain, John Ferrier and the little girl, Lucy, grew accustomed to the rigid but orderly life of the Mormon settlement in the valley of the Great Salt Lake. The Mormons, under the stern rule of Brigham Young, had carved out a community in the wilderness, a city risen out of dust and toil, supported by unshakable obedience to their prophet. In those early days, when persecution from without bound them closely together, the iron discipline was accepted by all with little complaint. John Ferrier, though a man of independence and strong will, submitted outwardly to the customs and requirements of the sect. He was allotted land which, by his own hard labor, soon blossomed into a prosperous farm. His industry and honesty made him respected among the brethren, while Lucy, with her beauty and gentleness, became admired by all who knew her. Yet for all their outward conformity, there was one article of the Mormon creed which Ferrier could never accept, and that was the practice of polygamy. The very thought of it was abhorrent to his nature, and he quietly resolved that, come what might, Lucy should never be forced into such a union. For many years the prophet's eye did not turn upon him. The community grew with new settlers arriving from distant lands, and Ferrier prospered silently among them. Lucy grew to womanhood, her grace and loveliness becoming the talk of the valley. Inevitably, suitors arose, young men of Mormon households who looked with favor upon her, not least because Ferrier's wealth would strengthen their own holdings. Among these were men of influence, and soon whispers reached Ferrier's ears that the prophet himself would expect Lucy to choose a husband from among the faithful. It was about this time that a young man, Jefferson Hope, came often to Ferrier's farm. He was not of the Mormon faith, but a hunter and frontiersman accustomed to the rough life of the mountains. His courage, resourcefulness, and honest spirit won Ferrier's approval, and Lucy's heart was soon his without reservation. Their affection blossomed in secret, for they well knew the peril of defying the prophet's will. Hope spoke of marriage and of leaving the valley for good, to seek their fortune elsewhere, where neither priests nor elders could dictate their lives. But Ferrier, cautious and mindful of the power that ruled over them, urged patience. He said, "Let us wait until the right moment comes. To leave now would be folly, but if the prophet presses us, then by heaven Lucy shall be free." That moment came sooner than Ferrier had expected. One summer's evening, as the setting sun lit up the mountains, a message arrived at Ferrier's door. A stern-faced messenger of the church brought word that Brigham Young required Ferrier's presence. The old farmer's heart sank, for he knew too well what this summons implied. Still, he rode into the city with outward calm, and was ushered into the presence of the prophet himself. Brigham Young was a man of commanding presence, his countenance stern, yet not without a certain rugged dignity. He greeted Ferrier with courtesy, but there was no mistaking the iron beneath his words. He reminded Ferrier of the blessings he had received from the saints, the rescue on the plain, the land, the prosperity, and then laid upon him the command that Lucy must marry one of the chosen brethren within a month's time. Ferrier's reply was respectful but firm. He declared his gratitude for what had been done for him, but made it plain that Lucy's choice should not be forced. The prophet's eyes hardened as he answered, "It is not for you to set aside the laws of our people. Take heed, John Ferrier, lest you fall into rebellion. We cannot and will not permit disobedience." With these words, Ferrier was dismissed. He returned home heavy-hearted, knowing that the prophet's command was no idle threat. When he told Lucy and Jefferson Hope of what had passed, the young man swore fiercely that they would not submit. Plans were quickly laid for flight. Hope promised to return within the week, bringing horses and provisions for their escape into the mountains. Ferrier, though wary of the dangers, agreed, for he knew that delay would mean ruin. That week was a time of anxious waiting. Every day brought new signs of surveillance. Dark figures were seen watching the farm from the hills. Horsemen passed by more often than before. Ferrier's once quiet life became a prison of fear, and yet within the house there was courage. Lucy bore up bravely, though her heart trembled, and Ferrier himself stood resolute. They pinned their hopes on Jefferson Hope, whose strong arm and fearless spirit seemed their only salvation. It was upon such a note of suspense that the first part of this chapter must close. The hand of the prophet had fallen. The shadow of the saints lay heavy upon Ferrier's household, and only flight remained to them if they were to preserve their liberty and their love. The days that followed were filled with a dread that pressed upon John Ferrier's household like a storm cloud before the tempest. Though the farm still stood in its peaceful valley, the air seemed charged with menace. At night, Ferrier would peer from his window and glimpse figures moving silently on the ridges, watchers who never approached, but whose presence was a warning in itself. By day, horsemen passed the farm, their eyes lingering too long upon Lucy. It was clear that the decree of the prophet was not a matter to be taken lightly. Disobedience would mean punishment, swift and unrelenting. Lucy bore her trials with quiet fortitude. Her love for Jefferson Hope gave her strength, though she shrank with fear whenever the name of the prophet was spoken. John Ferrier, on the other hand, became grim and silent. He made little show of emotion, but there was in his manner the cold determination of a man who, having set his course, would never swerve from it. Hope's return was awaited with desperate longing. He had gone into the mountains to secure horses and provisions, promising to come back within the week. Every sound upon the road, every echo from the hills made Lucy's heart leap with expectation. But the days passed slowly, and still he did not come. At last, one evening, as the shadows lengthened, Ferrier saw a solitary horseman ride swiftly towards the farm. It was Jefferson Hope, travel-worn and sunburned, yet full of energy. He brought with him 2 strong horses, well-fed and rested, and a mule laden with supplies. He had thought of everything: food, waterskins, blankets, and even spare ammunition. "We leave tomorrow night," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Another day here would be madness. The saints are watching, and if we tarry, they will strike." That night, father and daughter scarcely slept. Each busied themselves with preparations, gathering such small treasures as they could carry, concealing them beneath their plain clothing, and readying themselves for the perilous flight. Ferrier, while making these arrangements, prayed silently that heaven might guide them safely out of the valley of bondage into the wide freedom of the mountains beyond. When darkness fell on the following evening, they set forth. The stars shone brightly, lighting their way with a cold, unearthly brilliance. Hope rode in front, scanning the road with a hunter's vigilance. Lucy, pale but composed, rode beside her father. Behind them, the laden mule plodded silently. Every rustle of the wind, every cry of a night bird seemed magnified into a sound of pursuit. They pressed onward, scarcely daring to speak. For some hours fortune favored them. The road lay empty,
and the silence of the wilderness wrapped them about. But as they neared the mouth of the valley, Hope suddenly reined in his horse and raised his hand. Far behind, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of hoofbeats. Their flight had been discovered. "Faster!" cried Hope, urging them on. "We may yet outpace them." The horses, strong and spirited, responded nobly, their hoofs striking sparks from the rocky path. For a time it seemed they might indeed escape, yet the pursuing sounds grew louder. The Mormons, skilled riders and relentless in their purpose, were gaining upon them. On they fled, the night air rushing past, the mountains looming ever closer. Hope turned often in his saddle, his rifle across his knees, ready to make a stand if pressed too hard. Ferrier, though aged, clung manfully to his seat, his eyes fixed upon the path that might lead them to liberty. Lucy, with lips pressed tight, rode with the courage of despair. At last they reached a narrow defile between towering cliffs. Hope guided them into it, believing the rocky walls might shield them from sight. But scarcely had they entered when the clatter of hooves resounded behind, and dark figures appeared at the mouth of the gorge. The pursuers were upon them. Realizing resistance was hopeless, Hope urged Ferrier and Lucy onward while he turned back to face their enemies. Shots rang out, echoing through the cliffs. Hope fought like a lion, but the numbers against him were too great. He was forced to retreat, bleeding from a wound, his horse staggering beneath him. Somehow he regained the trail and rejoined the fugitives, his face grim with pain. "There is no escape tonight," he gasped. "They are too many. Ride on, I'll hold them back." But Ferrier refused to leave him. The little party pressed forward together, though every step brought fresh peril. By dawn they were spent, their horses foaming and exhausted, their strength nearly gone, and still the shadow of pursuit lay heavy upon them. It was then that the end came. As the first light of morning touched the peaks, a band of horsemen swept down upon them from a side valley. Outnumbered and surrounded, Ferrier and Lucy were seized. Hope, half conscious from his wound, was struck down and left for dead upon the rocks. When he awoke hours later, the valley was silent. His horse was gone, his rifle broken, and the trail of the captors led back into the stronghold of the Mormons. With a cry of anguish, he staggered to his feet, swearing vengeance upon those who had robbed him of all that he held dear. From that hour, Jefferson Hope lived for one purpose alone: to avenge John Ferrier and to rescue, if it might be, the innocent Lucy from her captors. And thus, dear reader, the chain of events was forged, which, after many years and across many lands, would draw two men to a fateful room in London, and place in the hands of Sherlock Holmes the clue to one of the strangest and most terrible crimes that ever stained the annals of the great city.
It was with no small sense of awe that I sat opposite Holmes in our Baker Street lodgings as he closed his narrative and leaned back with that curious mixture of triumph and fatigue which always followed his intellectual exertions. To me, as to the police, the mystery had been impenetrable, yet Holmes, with that strange method of his, half science, half intuition, had plucked the tangled skein apart and laid it bare before us. The hour was late, and outside London lay wrapped in the muffling cloak of night. The gas lamps glimmered through the mist, carriages rattled faintly in the distance, and the ceaseless hum of the great city came softened to our ears. Within, our fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the books and curiosities that crowded the sitting-room. Holmes had spoken calmly, almost coldly, as though the events he described were but problems worked out upon a slate. Yet for me, hearing them, it was as though a veil had been lifted, and I glimpsed the vast machinery of fate moving behind the common life of men.
I had before me the figure of Jefferson Hope, that gaunt, weather-beaten hunter, standing in that London room with the iron hand of the law on his shoulder. His story, strange and terrible, had carried me back to the far-off valleys of Utah, to the stern mountains and the narrow creeds that ruled them. I could almost hear the echo of hoofbeats, the cries of the pursuers, the clash of desperate men in the night. And then to think that such passions, such vengeance, had followed across oceans and years to burst forth at last in a quiet house off Brixton Road. Holmes lit his pipe and smoked in silence, his sharp eyes half closed, his lean figure sunk deep in the armchair. Lestrade, small, wiry, and businesslike, sat with his notebook open, while Gregson, more florid and pompous, bustled importantly. Between them the prisoner was placed, Jefferson Hope, handcuffed yet erect, his eyes blazing with the fire of his tale. The detectives, so often at variance, had joined in a rare truce, united by their admiration, if grudging, for Holmes's triumph. Holmes's voice broke the silence. "Gentlemen," said he, "you now understand the chain that binds this crime together. You have seen how the scarlet thread of murder runs through the colorless skein of life, and how it is my task to unravel it and expose every inch of it." His words struck me with force. I felt them not merely as the closing of an argument, but as the declaration of a principle, almost a creed. In Holmes's mind, life itself was but a web of causes and effects, waiting for the man who could read them. Jefferson Hope then spoke, his deep voice hoarse with suffering, yet steady. "You know the truth of it now. I did what I did because it was laid upon me. Years I have carried this burden. Years I have hunted the men who murdered the only good friend I ever had, and who broke the heart of the woman I loved. If it be crime to strike them down, then I am guilty. But I say before God, it was justice." There was silence in the room. Even Lestrade, no sentimentalist, shifted uneasily. For my part, I could not look unmoved upon the man. His face, rugged and scarred, bore the lines of hardship. His eyes had that far-away look of the wilderness, the gaze of one who had looked long upon the horizon. He was no common criminal, no petty schemer, but a man who had given his life to a cause, however grim. Gregson, ever practical, broke in. "You may save your speeches for the judge, my man. For us, the business is done. You will be lodged in Newgate before the night is out." Hope smiled grimly. "The judge, the gallows, it matters little. My work is finished. I have had my revenge, and I can die content." Holmes regarded him with keen interest, as though studying some rare specimen. "You speak as though your strength were ebbing, Mr. Hope," he said quietly. The prisoner drew a long breath. "It is so. I have not many days left. The aneurysm has been on me for years. The doctors in America told me it would strike me down suddenly. Perhaps I should thank them, for it lent swiftness to my purpose. But now—" he placed his hand upon his breast and staggered slightly. "Now the end is near." We sprang to his assistance, but he waved us aside. "Do not trouble yourselves. I shall last long enough to stand before the magistrate, and that is all that is required." There was a dignity in his bearing which compelled respect. For all his roughness, Jefferson Hope seemed a figure out of some stern saga, a man shaped by the mountains and deserts, hardened by loss, yet driven by love as much as vengeance. Holmes alone appeared unmoved. To him, the man was but the final piece of a puzzle, the last entry in the ledger of deduction. Yet I, who had listened to his tale, who had pictured the girl torn from her lover and the old man struck down for his fidelity, felt a pang of sympathy, almost admiration, for this outlaw of destiny. The carriage was called to convey the prisoner to Newgate. As the detectives busied themselves with the formalities, Holmes leaned towards me. "You see, Watson, how the most remarkable dramas lie beneath the surface of ordinary life. Brixton Road seemed commonplace enough, yet within its walls was enacted a tragedy as wild as any in the wilderness. I nodded, for the truth of it was plain. The city, vast and indifferent, had swallowed up the tale of John Ferrier, Lucy, and Jefferson Hope, and none but we who had heard it would know of the passions that had raged like hidden fires beneath the pavement of London. And so it was that Jefferson Hope, the hunter-turned-avenger, passed from our sight, and the strange case which had first brought me close to Sherlock Holmes drew towards its end.
The next morning dawned grey and chill over London, with a fine drizzle misting the streets and casting a damp heaviness upon all who moved about their business. In Baker Street, however, the atmosphere was charged with a kind of expectant calm. Holmes, who had scarcely slept, sat in his dressing-gown with the inevitable pipe between his fingers, his sharp eyes alight with that inner fire which the successful unravelling of a mystery always awakened in him. I, for my part, felt a strange restlessness. Though the case had been solved, its echoes remained within me. Jefferson Hope's tale had stirred something deeper than curiosity. It had drawn me into the tragic undercurrents of human life, into passions and loyalties that the law could scarcely measure. At an early hour came the news we half expected. Jefferson Hope was dead. The aneurysm of which he had spoken with such certainty had carried him off suddenly in the night, even as he lay in custody. The law, which he had so grimly defied, would never have its chance upon him. His own frail heart had been the executioner. When Holmes heard the tidings, he merely inclined his head. "It was inevitable," he said, as if he had foreseen it all along. "The hand of fate struck before the hand of man. There was nothing more to be said." Yet I, though less certain of fate, could not help but feel that Hope's death was fitting. He had spent his years in the shadow of vengeance, and he had accomplished all that he had set out to do. The rest of life held little for him. If justice had been denied him by the courts, it had nonetheless been carried out in his own way, and the balance of his heart was settled. Lestrade and Gregson came bustling into our rooms later that morning, full of official satisfaction. They were eager to claim credit, to tie off loose ends, to assure Holmes and myself that the case would stand as one of the most remarkable ever recorded in their careers. "We shall make our report," said Gregson pompously, "and your name, Mr. Holmes, will of course be included. Scotland Yard does not forget those who render assistance." Holmes smiled faintly. "I am flattered," he said, "but you will find that the public has small interest in the truth. They prefer the show of things. You will take the laurels, gentlemen, while I am content with the knowledge that the puzzle was correctly solved." Lestrade chuckled. "Well, you've had your amusement, Mr. Holmes, and we've had our case closed, so everyone is satisfied." When they had gone, Holmes turned to me with that half-sardonic expression of his. "You see, Watson, it is exactly as I said. They claim the glory, while I keep the reality. But no matter. It is my business to unravel problems, not to seek applause." I could not but admire the calm indifference with which he spoke. For me, the tale would always remain vivid. The desperate flight of John Ferrier, the sorrow of poor Lucy, the vengeance of Jefferson Hope, and the quiet London lodging where it had all come to its close. To Holmes, it was but one more demonstration of his art, another proof of his system of reasoning. That evening, as we sat together once more, Holmes grew reflective. "What is life, Watson?" he said, "but a series of problems waiting for the man who can read them. Each crime is but a knot tied by human passions, and it is for us to untie it strand by strand." I nodded.
struck as always by the clarity of his thought. For myself, however, I saw more than strands and knots. I saw the human hearts that lay behind them, the love, the hate, the loyalty, and the despair. If Holmes read life as logic, I read it as tragedy. And between us, perhaps the truth was found. Thus ended our first great case together, and though I did not yet know it, many others would follow, each as strange and compelling as the last. But A Study in Scarlet would forever remain in my mind the doorway through which I stepped into the shadowed yet fascinating world of Sherlock Holmes.